Yeah, we back. We back. Now, today's video is going to be a follow-up video to one I dropped, a few weeks back, couple weeks back. The first one being tailored up on the screen. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger create the Alliance of Sahelian States. Pan-Africanism 101. Burkina Faso gold refinery under construction. Why are black people scared to discuss Arabs? Now, today's video is going to be a follow-up to those three videos. And like I mentioned before, when it comes to the European powers, when it comes to the imperial nations, we have no issue having that discussion. We have no issue when that topic is brought up. But when it comes to discussing the Arabs, for whatever reason, it's a very controversial topic. It's a taboo topic. But you know me, I never cared about that, man. I'm always going to touch them topics, man. I'm always going to touch that controversial topic. So today we're going to talk about it once again. Take a look up on the screen. Al-Qaeda issues a new threat to the Sahel. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb calls on citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to attack their governments. Terrorist groups brands the country's new military leaders as treacherous. All three nations making gains against Al-Qaeda after cutting ties with France and expelling French troops. Mali recently captured the rebel stronghold of Kidal. I was going to make a video on that, but yeah, the Malian army actually captured a city that was a stronghold of the jihadist terrorists in the region for a very long time. Shout out to them. The West African trio, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, of course, accused the former colonizer of backing terrorists and ditched the French-led G5 security pact. In September, they formed their own military alliance to fight terrorists in the Sahel. I did a video about that a while back, and just now, the major outlets are just now dropping articles about that months and months later, but, it is what it is, though. But now, let's get into the topic of today's video. Like I mentioned in previous videos, one day, black men are going to have the conversation as it relates to our relationship that we have with Arab men or men who subscribe to Arab culture. It's something that we can no longer ignore. We have to address the issue head on eventually, man. We can't just keep dragging our feet with this shit because it's a very urgent topic, because too many lives are being lost. Too many people are being displaced. It's a real issue with real humanitarian consequences. Now, let's get into it. Take a look up on the screen. It's not just the West that is concerned by the three revolutionary governments of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali joining forces to defend their borders against imperialism and jihadist terrorists. Al-Qaeda is clearly worried too. In a 22-minute video published this week, the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Iyad Agali, branded the country's new military leaders as treacherous. He then called for their citizens to join his ranks and fight against them. You could call it a sign of desperation. Since the public-supported coups in these nations, Al-Qaeda has been on the back foot, losing swaths of territory, with Mali recently taking the rebel stronghold of Kidal. Coincidentally or not, these successes follow the expulsion of French troops from the region by the West African trio, who accused them of backing the insurgents. In August 2022, Mali's foreign minister, Abdoulaye Diop, alleged France was providing weapons and intelligence to the terrorist groups. In a letter addressed to the United Nations Security Council, he stated, "These flagrant violations of Malian airspace were used by France to collect information for terrorist groups operating in the Sahel and to drop arms and ammunition to them." For decades, Western-aligned presidents in this part of Africa backed their former colonizer and welcomed their soldiers. That relationship has now been turned on its head by military takeovers backed by the majority of the citizens. It's something that's clearly rattling the West and now Al-Qaeda. Now, if you take a look up on the screen, this is the leader, so-called leader of Al-Qaeda, in this part of Africa. What's his name? He's not that important. I don't give a fuck about his name, but he calls himself Iyad Agali, right? And he's the one who called upon the citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to join his cause and to rise up against the governments, the military governments that are currently in place, right? And it's crazy because, shout out to my brothers who, like I said, when it comes to spirituality, I'm very tolerant. I don't got any issue with any brothers who subscribe to Islam. If you're a Muslim and you're a black man, you still my brother to me, bro. I don't care about none of that. When I talk about the Arab problem, you know what I'm talking about, brother. You know what I'm talking about. But one thing I want to address, when I bring up this topic, usually when it comes to my brothers who subscribe to Islam, I notice they have some type of a brotherhood when it comes to the Arab men, because like I said, Islam is the unifier, right? Like Islam unites men of different cultures, different races, different ethnic groups. So they view, not all of them, but a lot of them view the Arab as their brother because of the spiritual commonality. But then I gotta ask, how come this brother right here, this guy right here, Iyad Agali, the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, how come he doesn't view, for example, the president of Mali as his brother? Because the president of Mali himself is a Muslim man. He's a black man, but he's a Muslim man, right? And I'm sure the leaders in Niger are also Muslim men. I'm not too sure about the leader in Burkina Faso, but Burkina Faso also has a heavy Muslim population. How come he doesn't show any solidarity to the black man who's also a Muslim? How come they don't show any solidarity to the black Muslims they massacre in the villages when they go on a jihadist terrorist mission? How come they don't show any solidarity with the black Muslim women and children they massacre in these villages? I gotta ask that question. It seems to me that it's a lot of one-sided solidarity. It's a lot of one-sided love. You know, one side is showing love, one side is showing solidarity, but the other side is playing for keeps. The other side is playing for their own economic and political interests. And one day we're gonna have to address this parasitic relationship. But anyways, let's switch gears for a little bit and let's talk about what's happening in Sudan, right? Because as you all know, it's not only Palestine that's going through it right now, the family in Sudan is also going through it right now, and we gotta shine a light on that as well. So take a look up on the screen. I believe this article came out yesterday or the day before. Arab fighters killed babies, boys, and men in war on Sudan tribe, the mothers allege. Let's jump into the article, not wasting no time. The Arab militiamen were hunting for boys that day. That's how they found 2-year-old Ibrahim. Ibrahim, his baby sister, and their mother were on the run in June, fleeing a weeks-long massacre in the Sudanese city of El Geneia. Arab militiamen had shot, stabbed, and burnt to death members of their tribe, the darker-skinned Masalit people. Abdel Karim's husband was among the dead, along with dozens of women and children. She and her kids were trying to make it to safety in neighboring Chad, and they almost did. About 10 kilometers from the border, she said, Arab paramilitary forces and militiamen stopped them and ordered her to hand over Ibrahim. They looked inside his clothes to inspect his gender, then set him down and began bashing his head with wooden rods. He was crying, "Mama, Mama." When she tried to rescue him, one of the men shot her below the shoulder, leaving a scar from the wound. I kept screaming to leave my son, don't kill my son. The men kept striking Ibrahim. You Zerga won't stay in El Geneia, the men shouted, using a racist term for darker-skinned people like the Masalit. They said if the boy grows up, he will fight us. Bleeding from her wound and with her daughter in her arms, Abdel Karim said she kept trying to stop the attack on Ibrahim, but the men continued beating him until he lay dead. Abdel Karim was one of the more than 40 mothers who described to Reuters how their children, mostly boys, were killed by Sudan's Rapid Support Forces paramilitary and its allied Arab militias during an ethnically targeted killing campaign this year in and around West Darfur capital of El Geneia. Her son and other children were part of the Masalit tribe, which is a majority in El Geneia until the RSF and Arab militias forced them out. Around 500,000 people, mostly Masalit, have left as a result of the violence. Thousands have died in the attacks. The dead include women and girls. Masalit women also have described enduring sexual assault at the hands of Arab-dominated RSF forces and its allies, as Reuters detailed last month. But in the killing spree, witnesses say Arab forces have specifically targeted males for death, from infants to adults. Now, brothers, when they say that males from infants to adults are the ones that are targeted for violent death, that means that this is a genocide, this is a violent campaign that is targeted against black men. Okay, this is specifically targeted against black African men, right? Of course, the women and the children and the mothers and the daughters are also suffering, but primarily the Arab militiamen in Sudan are targeting the black men of the region, the black African men, the non-Arab men. Now let's continue. 36 of the mothers told Reuters their children were shot from close range, 33 of them boys and 8 girls. 6 of the mothers said they watched as their children, some as young as 6 months old, were beaten to death by the RSF and Arab militia fighters. 5 of the 6 children killed this way were boys. The killers used knives too. 10 people who escaped to Chad told Reuters they saw children having their throats slit. All were boys. Most of these children were killed as they fled with their mothers from the city. En route to Chad, 5 survivors described seeing militiamen stop women with babies, check the child's gender, and kill it if it turned out to be a boy. Masalit men were also hunted down by the RSF and its allies. In the most recent round of violence in early November, Reuters revealed that hundreds of young Masalit men were rounded up and taken to various locations where eyewitnesses said some of them were executed. More than 30 women interviewed for this report said their husbands, brothers, and fathers were killed or went missing in this year's attacks. Several women said they hid their brothers or smuggled them out of the city for fear they would be targeted. Dozens of men recounted how they cut through valleys and traveled along remote routes to Chad to evade checkpoints set up by the RSF and Arab militias. Several mothers of slain children, as well as other witnesses, said the militiamen made clear why they were targeting Masalit boys. They wanted to be sure the children would not grow up to be fighters and one day seek revenge for the attacks against them. So, in their mind, they said we got to get rid of the babies now, because the young infant boys will grow up to be the black African men that will seek vengeance for their fallen compatriots, which is true. Anyway, let's continue. Uniformed RSF forces and Arab militiamen were stopping masculine women on the same route who were heading for Chad with babies on their backs. The militiamen aimed their guns at the mothers and ordered them to hand over their children. The gunmen then opened the baby's clothes to check his gender. If they found it was a boy, they shot them right away. Maimouna Abakar, 25 years old, and her 9-month-old daughter narrowly escaped with their lives twice as they fled the city on June 15th. First, she said, they were surrounded by a group of knife-wielding Arab militiamen. The men forced Abakar to take her baby off her back, then remove the child's clothes. "It's a girl," Abakar recalls screaming. She snatched her baby back and the men allowed her to go. A few kilometers later, she was stopped again by armed men and her baby was checked once again. In an effort to save their sons, some mothers dressed them in women's clothes. Now, I just want to stop just to add this into the subject. You notice that Arab aggression is particularly focused against black African men. It's a reason why, even though their slave trade lasted longer than the European slave trade, you don't really see a large diaspora community of descendants from the trans-Saharan slave trade. It's a reason for that. Largely due to the annihilation of the black African man during the trans-Saharan slave trade. Now, let's continue. One woman said her 16-year-old son, her father, and her brother were all killed in April by the RSF, gunned down in a neighbor's home where they tried to hide. A second woman said Arab militiamen descended on a school in a displaced persons camp also in April and opened fire on a group of men there, killing her father and one of her brothers. The next day, she said, they killed another one of her brothers. A third woman described how 4 of her uncles were gunned down in the family home in early November. Her husband, a soldier in the Sudanese army, has been missing since then. Now, if you take a look up on the screen, this is the gentleman who is the leader of the so-called RSF. When they talk about, these Arab militiamen, this is the so-called leader, Muhammad something. Yeah, as you can see, off the surface, you could say, oh, this is not a black man. Nah, not really. He wouldn't call himself a black man. He wouldn't identify himself as a black man. A lot of these guys are self-proclaimed Arabs, self-identified Arabs. And to understand, like I said, I'm not Sudanese, so a Sudanese man would have to really come and speak on the subject with authority. I can only give my basic understanding. But how these so-called Sudanese Arabs came about was, unfortunately, we got to go back to the Islamic conquest, the Arab invasions of the 7th century, right? Now, I wouldn't say that the Arabs kind of violently invaded Sudan, how they did, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and a lot of North African territories. How they came to establish influence in Sudan was mainly through, trade, migration, things like that, intermixing amongst the local populations. That is how you see some of these guys who physically, to the blind eye, you can see, oh, that's a black man. But when you look deeper, you can see, not really. It's definitely some admixture going on. It's definitely some genetic mixture going on from, centuries and centuries of intermixing. So a lot of these guys, to the blind eye, they might appear as black African men, but culturally, they don't identify as black African men. Culturally, they identify as Arab men, because a lot of them are the descendants of the Arab migrants, the Arab nomads that came from the Middle East to come and establish trade relations with the black African men in the region now known as Sudan. And through centuries and centuries of intermixing, you now have men who appear as black African men on the surface, but they subscribe to Arab culture. They follow Arab customs. They identify as Arab men because they are following the culture of their Arab ancestors, their Arab predecessors, right? They're following the culture of their father's people, which makes sense. A similar phenomenon took place in the European colonies, where you had millions and millions and millions of mixed race children that were created on plantations. And I'm talking about outside of the United States, where in the United States they had the one-drop rule, but outside of the United States they didn't have a one-drop rule. So in a lot of cases, the mixed race offspring of the European and the African woman, they would identify with their father's people. They would identify with the European, even though on the surface they might physically present as a black man, but they identify as a European man. They follow the traditions and culture of their fathers. So this is something that black men have been dealing with for, as long as history has been recorded. This is how Egypt fell. We had a lot of these mixed race boys in Egypt, riding for their father's people, riding for their mother's people. that had double allegiances. This is how so many empires have fell, so many conflicts have been created because of these mixed race offspring with so many different allegiances that were fighting against the black African man. You know, it's so many instances, especially during the days of the trans-Saharan slave trade, the Arab slave trade, right? The Arab men would get black women pregnant, and the mixed race offspring they created with the black woman, they would grow up and they would become generals and warriors and fight against and wage military campaigns against the black man, against the black African man. That's also how the Songhai Empire was destroyed, right? One of the most, if not the most powerful empire in the history of West Africa, right? I believe the Sultan of Morocco, who invaded the Songhai Empire, I believe he was a mixed race man with an Arab father and a black African mother, if I'm not mistaken. And when Songhai fell, like I said, one of the most powerful African empires in the history of the African continent, when Songhai fell, you could kind of say that was a major turning point on the continent, particularly in West Africa, because Songhai marked a period of stability, wealth, and grandeur. After the Mali Empire fell off, Songhai rose to power, dominating the trade in gold and salt, dominated the trade routes. It was a center of learning, center of academia, center of trade. Man, Songhai was, man, they were doing their thing. They were doing their thing, man. Black Muslim men, you know, regardless of whatever you may say, the black Muslim men have a history of creating sustainable, very wealthy, and prosperous societies. They do. And these were not Muslim men who were the mixed race offspring of Arab nomads or Arab invaders. No, these were black African men who subscribed to Islam. When you talk about the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, etc., these were black African men who simply subscribed to Islam. They were not the mixed race offspring of Arab invaders or Arab migrants or Arab nomads. We got to make sure we get that straight, first of all. But anyways, going back to the fall of the Songhai Empire, and when you talk about the Songhai Empire, it spanned the modern day territories of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, parts of Nigeria, Chad. A lot of modern day nations comprised the ancient Songhai Empire. It was a vast territory, a vast empire that stretched a long distance, right? Like I said, very prosperous, very wealthy. But like I said, even though the black Muslims in the Songhai, they were Muslim, and the Moroccans that invaded, they were Muslim, for whatever reason, how come the Moroccans did not see the black men in the Songhai Empire as their brothers? Why did they invade the Songhai? Why did they destroy the Songhai Empire in 1591? We have to ask that question. You know, we have to ask that question. How come that same solidarity is never extended to the black man? How come the Arab Muslim doesn't extend the same love and respect and brotherhood to the black Muslim man? How come the so-called Arab Muslim man has such animosity towards the black African man, whether he is Muslim or not? We have to ask that, right? And when you look at the current instability that is happening in the Sahel right now, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, in terms of the jihadist terrorists, how come the so-called Muslims from Al-Qaeda, how come they don't have any solidarity with the black Muslims in these nations, or the black Muslims that control these governments? Why are they calling for the citizens of these nations to rise up against their governments? What happened to the Muslim solidarity? What happened to the solidarity amongst men who subscribe to Islam, right? Going back to the guy who, you know, the dude who's the leader of the Islamic, you know, Al-Qaeda network in the Maghreb, how come he is calling for violence against other Muslim men? How come he's calling for violence against black men who are Muslim? I don't understand it, you know? So some of y'all boys gonna have to get into the comment section and explain that to me. Explain that to me, because I thought that, you know, a Muslim is supposed to be your brother. But how come when it comes to the black man, that brotherhood is never really extended? I never really understood that. And we've been dealing with this so-called Arab problem since the invasions back in the 7th century. When they captured North Africa, when their mixed race offspring invaded West Africa and sent us into the dark ages. Because when the Songhai Empire fell, when all that wealth and prosperity and stability fell, it plunged West Africa into a period of instability, fragmentation, and we are still dealing with the instability and the ramifications of these events centuries and centuries and centuries later, to where we still have these Arab men and these Arab butt kisser dudes who's still trying to wage war against black African men. And for whatever reason, like I said, many people don't want to touch on this topic. You know, we're gonna talk about the Israelis all day, we're gonna talk about the Europeans all day, but we never want to talk about the Arab topic. We never want to touch the Arab subject. We never want to talk about the networks that Al-Qaeda got across the continent. We never want to talk about how these so-called Arab paramilitary forces, like in Sudan, they're backed and financially supported by regimes in the Middle East. We never want to talk about how our people are treated in the Middle East. We never want to talk about how this whole entire network smuggling natural resources outside of the continent into the Middle East. Like I touched on it back in my video about the Burkina Faso gold refinery. There's whole entire networks of people smuggling gold outside of the continent and into the Middle East without the central governments even getting a tax on the export. So it's a lot of underhanded parasitic bullshit going on besides the violence, but it's a lot of shit that we don't discuss, that we should discuss with the same amount of passion that we discuss all other topics and all other adversaries and enemies that we have. Because don't get it twisted, don't get it fucked up. The Arab is absolutely one of our adversaries. His mixed race children, his mixed race descendants are absolutely our adversaries. They let it be known. They're unapologetic with it. I told you. So listen, man, at the end of the day, man, like I told you, life is about power, not morality. Life is about protecting your economic and political interests by any means necessary. You know? And until we understand that, we always gonna be behind, man. We always gonna be on the back foot. But anyways, I'm not gonna let this be too long, man. You know, I'm sending my love to the family in Sudan, sending my love to the family in the Sahel, sending my love to everybody across the world. You know, I love my people above everything else, so it is what it is. It's your boy Neferkar Salim, back in the building, yes indeed. Cash App up on the screen, and I'm gone. Peace.
Reincarnated, I'm back in original fashion. I left on a horse and came back in the ass, and I left with abundance and came back to famine. We used to be pyramids, now we be rapping. Look how the mighty have fallen. Used to be running, now we be walking. When you be cooning, that's when they applauded. Selling your soul, your sons and your daughter. Gotta come up in this shit, they stuck in the mix. Really, my heart it be breaking. That's why I'm stacking that paper and handle my business. Pass it down in generation. Talking about money and power and building a nation. That's a deadly combination. Never be watching the TV, they pushing agendas, falsifying information. Know they got malice intentions. Step in the room and I'm feeling the tension. Enemy watching, he blocking my vision. Pay for the check cause I need my redemption. Building my kingdom, I need it protected. Ready for war like a young Money Congo. Never decided the team is the motto. Up in the crib and I'm whipping up waffles. Up in the crib and I'm smoking gelato. I'm chilling, I'm taking my pain and make it ambition. I'm blessed by the gods, but I ain't religious. I came for the power, they came for the bitch. They making no hourly wage. I got business, this shit is an art and they could never be taught. Selling my soul, I can never be bought. Play with my money, I see you in court. Run to the check and I do it for sport. Babylon falling, I go to the source. Packing my luggage and go overseas. Shorty be with me and she so elite. Shorty be chocolate, I'm calling her Hershey. Secret intelligence probably gon' murk me. Don't fuck with friends cause nigga I'm Haitian. Say the wrong shit and you're smacking their faces.